great investors have a similar mindset, right? When people think about Buffett and Munger, for instance, they didn't tell the CFO what to do. They would hire the right people and let them run their own race. You have to trust them to a degree. Instances where I've seen things break down are where the senior marketing people are not trusted and they are just given metrics to target. When there are things like attribution that are not considered, or the other aspects of performance of these campaigns that are not properly considered, you end up putting a box around the marketer or the marketing group. CFOs can go wrong, in my opinion. I've managed like $4 billion of ads. We've worked with hundreds and hundreds of different companies. If you think about the marketing spend as the like investment currency, like we invest in different channels and it's up to us to report on success, subject to these conversations that we have, which have to be really high quality conversations with a finance team or the VP that we report to or a CMO that we report to.
Is this thing on?
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Why, thank you, Fat Joe. Welcome to Run the Numbers, where I interview world-class CFOs, operators, and the VCs who fund them on how to get the most out of your company's performance. This podcast is a playbook of sorts for ambitious people in the world of finance, strategy, and ops. Today, my guest is Jonathan Becker, a legend in the world of performance marketing. Jonathan and his team at Thrive Digital have planned, built, and executed more than $4 billion in paid acquisition budgets for companies like Uber, Asana, Square, Masterclass, Coinbase, Charity Water, and many more. We dissect marketing budgets from the lens of a CFO and go deep on ROI, marketing unit economics, funding experiments, analyzing attribution by channel, and one of my favorite topics, LTV to CAC. Jonathan also gives us some cool stories about companies who have scaled on the backs of just one or two marketing channels, like Expedia. And we also riff on the concept of super expensive Super Bowl ads. This is a masterclass in how finance and marketing can team up to use paid growth as a lever for expansion. All of this and much, much more after a short word from our sponsors. As a SaaS CFO, I know firsthand how difficult it is to report on SaaS metrics. We've all seen a deal close at the end of the month, but the customer's contract doesn't actually start until the middle of the next month, creating the classic discrepancy between bookings or committed ARR and actual ARR, the real stuff. That's why I'm so pumped to be partnering with Maxio, a company trusted by thousands of SaaS companies to understand these reporting nuances. They basically built and automated the SaaS dashboard I tried to manually cobble together for 3 years. In 2022, SaaS Optics and Chargify combined to become Maxio, the only billing and financial operations platform that was purpose-built for B2B SaaS. They're helping SaaS finance teams automate billing and RevRec, manage collections and payments, and put together investor-grade reporting packages. Visit maxio.com/runthenumbers to learn how Maxio can help you supercharge financial operations in 2024. Request a demo using the Run the Numbers link and receive a 10% discount on your first year with Maxio. That's maxio.com/runthenumbers. Reduce burn, extend runway, do more with less. Operational efficiency. These are all catchphrases that we know all too well because of the headwinds business leaders face in today's growth environment. Growth is now a battle, not a breeze. While teams are on the front lines fighting every day for top-line yardage, there are hidden savings opportunities right beneath their feet. That's where Tropic comes into play. Their procurement platform brings order and process to a historically decentralized and chaotic business function: purchasing and supplier management. Tropic serves as the front door for procurement that your entire company will want to use. By combining intake forms, pricing benchmarks, approval workflows, and supplier management all in one place, Tropic makes savings opportunities easy to find and act on. When you pour blood, sweat, and tears into revenue growth, doesn't it make sense to protect what you have fought for? Visit tropicapp.io, that's tropicapp.io, to learn how modern businesses are controlling spend to extend their runway. Your board will thank you. Your budget will thank you. Your bottom line will thank you. Welcome back to the Run the Numbers podcast. I'm here with Jonathan Becker of Thrive Digital, a man who perhaps has spent more of your marketing dollars than anyone else in the world. Jonathan, thanks for joining.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, Jonathan, I want to start out with maybe something that's a bit of a joke or a myth of lore in Silicon Valley, and that's that 80% of venture funding dollars ultimately flow to Google. Is there any truth in that statement?
I've heard that too. It's kind of this funny concept that just basically says Google is a money making machine. When I think about it, I don't know about venture funding dollars, but Alphabet itself made like $300 billion last year in total revenue. You got to think about that not only as ads, but also cloud, the Play Store and devices. And if the question is, does a modern startup or even a, scaled institutional type business spend a lot of money on what Google has to offer? I have to imagine yes. But it's not just startups. I think there was like $345 billion in venture financing in 2023, something like that. The numbers certainly fit together to support what you're saying, but I think that ignores like a huge part of the industry, which is like your Fortune 500 companies that also invest heavily in this stuff. So does Google make a lot of money? Yes. And is most of it on ads, which is probably what we'll end up talking about today? Definitely.
So I reached out to you and I sent you an email like, listen, I'm a startup CFO. You run a company that helps other tech companies basically spend their money in a better way to get results on their paid marketing, which I believe is called performance marketing. And I'm always staring at P&Ls, wondering, what are we spending all these marketing dollars on? And are we getting an ROI? And some of the terms that are thrown around at me from the CMO seat are, this is for brand marketing, this is for performance marketing. Can you just kind of describe for the finance and strategy dorks out there who may be too afraid to ask the question, what's the difference between brand marketing and performance marketing? Is brand marketing just like we don't know what the return is? Is that what they're saying?
There used to be no distinction between brand marketing and performance marketing because, 20 years ago, performance marketing didn't really exist. So in the age of, channels arising where the idea is that things are heavily, heavily measurable, there's this like group of advertising opportunities that start to get labeled as performance marketing. The real difference, in 2024 between the two is that brand marketing, if I'm a brand marketer, I'm essentially presupposing who my customer is. And when I buy media, I am kind of anticipating or guesstimating where that supposed, marketing persona will spend time online or offline. So it's Harry or CJ, and they're, between this age and this age, and they live in the Pacific Northwest. And so they're going to watch this television show because people from in that demographic watch that television show. So we're going to place our ads there. So they presuppose who their customer is. In performance marketing, it's a little bit different. We kind of cast a net through targeting conditions and then learn who the customer was afterwards. I have no bias as to who will buy a product or service ahead of time. I'm just saying, so long as they conform to these criteria or these conditions, I'm happy to get their conversion. And so that's the real difference between, brand marketing and performance marketing. In terms of things being measurable, which was kind of the second part of your question, I'll talk about this maybe a little bit more, but these days, a lot of things that used to not be considered performance marketing can be considered performance channels if they are managed properly. And that has everything to do with measurement and how you set up tests and all of that. So I would say, to CFOs, the general idea is that back in the day, brand marketing, so to speak, was maybe a little bit less technical, a little bit less focused on the actual measurement component. These days, maybe that's not so much the case.
So to make it a little more real, we have sponsors for this podcast, which is catering towards an audience of CFOs and the like. Is that brand marketing then?
Most podcast inventory is bought in a brand marketing, like top of funnel, we would call it in performance marketing context. Doesn't mean that the people who are buying these placements don't care about the ROI though.
Got it. That's super helpful. And you had brought up the term ROI, a term that some marketers cringe from because they don't know the answer when it comes to attribution, and others love to hear it because they've got all their data right. And it's a question that a lot of CFOs are asking these days. What does good look like in terms of a return on investment when you look at a media budget? What should we hold the CMO accountable for?
Right. So, Generally speaking, when people hire Thrive, my performance marketing agency, the expectation is that we're getting them a 2 to 4 ROAS on average. That is kind of on a monthly measured cadence. So if I was to spend $100 today, the idea is that you get 300, 400, anywhere between $200 and $300 or $400 back. That's measurable, hopefully, in the same month. It's not really that simple. I think there's nuance here between whether you have an e-com project and there's a really quick payback. Someone pays you for a consumer item and you make all the revenue immediately post transaction, or whether it is like a lead generation project where just by definition, typically B2C or B2B have a longer period between, let's say, a click of an ad and then someone actually making a purchase decision around buying a service. So there's things we can do in between to net that out. But essentially, that's kind of the types of returns and timelines that people generally think about.
I was listening to another podcast you were on preparing for this one, and you had made a joke that the best investors in the world are supposed to get 8% or 10% a year ROI, but you're stuck trying to get people 2 to 4.
2 to 400%.
2 to 4x, 2 to 4x.
Yeah. I was saying that it's true, right? Any other form of dollars being invested, you're a hero if you get like 6% or 8% compounded annually. If you can do that, year in, year out, you are a legend in investing because of compounding. But in marketing, and this, goes into a lot of different aspects of marketing, I think people are a little bit short-sighted. So it's seen less as an investment, although I see it as an investment, and more of just like an expenditure and transactional expenditure where the idea is, hey, we spent this much, what did we get? And I want to know today. And so people's expectations around this are very different, but I would argue that, setting up a marketing function within an organization, investing in roles and team members, and then ultimately like judging performance is not dissimilar to investing, just the expectations are.
Yeah. And there is, though, a kind of a law of diminishing returns, though, in marketing, right? If I'm working with a company like yours, should I expect it to get tougher over time to keep acquiring those customers, or does it get easier because people now know who I am?
So both, I would say. So the brand marketing component and like the performance marketing top of funnel component, let's call it, as a company gets more famous, people are more easily able to recognize, particular brand in an ad and essentially trust that ad in terms of the product or service that it's selling. So that's kind of one component. The problem is, despite the fact that there's like hundreds of millions or billions of people collectively in particular audiences that we might be targeting, there's only so many people in a particular audience. And so if you just want to think about it as, hey, can I scale the amount of water consumed by humans in the US infinitely? No, you can't, because there's only so many people that drink water every day. And there's going to be a point where, the more water you give to people, not necessarily the amount of more water people drink. And so ads are kind of the same as that. This obviously, there's like a whole bunch of things that, roll up into this question. But yes, there are diminishing rates of return, sometimes strong diminishing rates of return by channel, by tactic as we scale. For that reason, channel exploration, so the discovery of new places to invest advertising dollars and kind of, market into them, is really important. We don't want to be entirely reliant on one, type of ad buying for that reason. And so when you think about scaling, there might be certain finite groups of people in particular audiences that you go after, but the idea is, are there new audiences we can go after, and are those, represented differently by different channels? So if you think about what you can achieve on Google versus what you can achieve on like Instagram or Facebook proper within the Meta ecosystem or on TikTok, people already know intuitively that there's kind of like different demographics of people that tend to spend time on all of these different places, and it's not unlimited. So we have to figure out all of those things simultaneously as ad buyers.
That's a hard nut to crack, because you're simultaneously trying to think what's the TAM, like, or I guess it would be the serviceable addressable market of people I can go after. And then you're also trying to flex that against the channels and how much to plow into it. It is kind of a multi-variable equation.
It is, except the way to win at that is to not think about all the problems simultaneously and just start somewhere and start to build.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Well, you know what I always say, maintaining compliance is never complete, which is why most security and IT teams feel like they're always in audit purgatory. I'm there right now. But there is a solution, and it's easier than you think. Escape the infinite loop by using ThoroPass's compliance and audit solution. ThoroPass is the only solution using AI-infused technology and in-house auditors to take your team from start to stamp without leaving the platform. As a winner of multiple G2 awards, including top awards for usability and service, your team is in good hands with ThoroPass. From onboarding with dedicated experts to audits from in-house auditors who know every aspect of your framework needs, you can have complete confidence in your ThoroPass compliance journey. ThoroPass is the only solution to offer audits for your most needed security frameworks. I'm talking HIPAA to HITRUST and SOC 2 to ISO 27001. Woo! If you need PCI, DSS, pen tests, or any other major compliance framework, ThoroPass can hook you up. With ThoroPass, you never need to worry again. Relax, we fix audits. Find more at thoropass.com. That's THOROPASS.com. Tell them your boy CJ sent you. They'll hook you up. Boom.
Most companies are not trying to boil the ocean with what they're doing, right? And in most industries, a company starting out, even if they're first, it's not a winner takes all equation. So you don't need all the customers, you don't need all the money, and ads don't have to work perfectly for you to be successful. Generally, what we see is people come to us because it's kind of working, or it's like maybe they think it can work and it's not working super well, or they haven't tried it yet and they want to start somewhere. And so, yes, if I look at our most scaled projects where we're spending, $10 million a month, and it took us several years to get there, it's complex. I have 25 people working on it. There's a whole team client side working on it. There's all kinds of testing and validation and attribution and reporting in place, and it's super sophisticated, but it takes time to get there. And certainly not all projects are at that stage. So I would just say that it's not something to be intimidated by. It's like good problems to have. If you start to think about the world like that because of a need or a capability, it probably means you're doing some of the right things.
And do you think the economics of ad spend change if I'm a B2B company versus a B2C company?
Totally. So I think that, B2B and B2C both fall into the lead generation category of marketing. And really the expectations of return have to do with like time. So budget is obviously a factor, but in an enterprise B2B lead gen scenario, the payback periods can be quite lengthy. We've worked with companies where it takes them 12 months to close a deal. That's B2B enterprise. That's not that crazy, actually. Like sometimes it's 6 to 12 months on the B2B enterprise side. B2C, where it's business to consumer and it's still a lead gen style of project, typically the payback periods are just smaller, shorter. So it's still lead gen, and the types of things you need for B2B are similar to what you need for B2C, but the payback period might be like 30 to 90 days, let's call it. So those are generalizations, but I'm just using them to illustrate like the expectations that you might have around the different styles of lead generation, I suppose.
I love how you're framing it up in terms of CAC payback period. That's such a good lens to look at it there.
Yeah, I actually think about it as so CAC and LTV have this interesting relationship, right? Every metric is a little bit subjective. And so when you're determining what the goalposts are for success within a particular company, you have to take a pretty good look at what you're aiming at in terms of what success looks like. And that has to do with, whether you're growth focused, whether you're profitability focused. The cost per acquiring a customer is, or CPA in certain instances, people call it that, is one metric to determine, the economics or the marketing economics of a performance marketing or growth marketing channel. But also, that doesn't really matter if you don't have a sense of lifetime value. And in fact, for most companies, lifetime value is this like fake number that they assume will be the case. Sometimes it's well vetted, sometimes it's not, but this is a really important like CFO level type question potentially. They have a sense of what LTV is, or sometimes it's actually just more aspirational. We hope LTV will be this. And so it's fine for us to, set a threshold for the cost of acquiring a customer type thing. The reality is, you're running a business, and these days I'm happy to say that, being profitable seems to be fashionable again. You just have to spend less. You have to earn more than you spend. Basically, it's quite simple. And so However, that is reflected within the metrics that drive these types of campaigns forward is actually fine as long as you're reasonable in terms of the metrics that you're thinking about. And then there's some like testing and validation, plan in place so that you don't just assume that performance is what it is or trust a particular number only later to learn that it's not actually working as well as you thought.
I would love to nerd out on metrics with you for a second. What are some of the other metrics you usually communicate to a CMO or even a CFO just to update them on the signals that are coming from a campaign they're running?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So there are like a ton of different metrics out there. Some of them are really basic, like, cost per click or cost per, 1,000 impressions or time on page, time on site. So these are the classic Google Analytics, a bygone era type metrics that most people ignore, but we see as like these like micro conversions, if you will, that indicate collectively whether someone on your website is a quality visitor or not. And so, like, do they index really highly on those little micro conversions and give us a sense of whether, from a latent point of view, there'll be a high quality lead, if you will, for us to continue targeting type thing. So that's kind of one bucket of metrics. The other bucket that's a little bit more obvious is similar to what we've just talked about. So concepts like, cost per acquired customer, CPA. Cost, again, CAC is another way of essentially saying that. ROAS, return on amount spent, that's what that means, is very fashionable. MER is something that we're hearing more and more and is starting to be kind of included within our campaigns. That's marketing efficiency ratio. And so, I won't define all of these. You can Google them, but essentially these metrics change, every few years, just like the technology does. So new capabilities or lack of capabilities when things actually get worse technologically, because that happens too, apparently. But people are constantly trying to figure out whether there's like a finite metric or some ratio, that ultimately gives them a sense of success over what they're doing. Marketing spend can be, volatile. And so you kind of have to like pick a set of metrics and then see them through for a period of time. But just curious, but you obviously have some familiarity with this. What have you seen work? And like, what do you think is the most popular metric that a CFO will often ask you about or that you're interested in?
CAC payback period is the one that always comes to mind for me, but lifetime value of a customer is important to know if you're a multi-product company and you're layering on additional innovations over time, because it's a lot of times you're almost giving away a product either for less than you could charge, or if it's even free and you're charging someone else in the ecosystem, especially if you're a B2B marketplace. So I look at the whole gamut of metrics here, but at the end of the day, what I'm trying to figure out is what's the total addressable wallet share that I can get from a customer now versus later, and how long can I get them to stick around? And like you said, if I can make that larger than the amount that I'm spending, that's just the basic economics of running a company.
So when I hear a CFO say something like that, what you just told me is what is important to your business. And then it's kind of my job to tell you what metrics reflect those goals, if that makes sense. But when I hear someone say, profitability is important, I want to grow, but I need to do it, feasibly and make sure that we're spending less than we're earning, then I'm going to say, well, let's use ROAS, at the campaign level. We use MER, so efficiency ratio at the entire marketing mix level. Let's determine what a contribution margin looks like. Let's factor these things into how we spend and what success looks like. It's a very different conversation.
Jonathan, can you speak to MER, the marketing efficiency ratio? That's a new one to me. I got to learn.
So ROAS is really good at determining kind of the ROI of the ad spend itself, but it doesn't take into consideration anything outside of ad spend and revenue. Like the calculation is literally like ad revenue over cost of ads. Whereas I believe MER is total revenue for the entire like department divided by all costs. So it's a more holistic view as to whether the entire program is functioning. Where these things break down, by the way, is in attribution. So how do you attribute whether the revenue that you're counting in these calculations actually was derived from the channels, or platforms that you're spending money on? And so that's where a lot of this can become subjective. That's actually like a separate part of this conversation. But it's an important theme in what we do, in that we're not like omniscient, right? Like we don't know and see everything. And so a lot of what we do, just like, actually in finance, to a degree has to be subjective. So we can think about, and we'll get back to your question in a second, but we can think about, ad spend as if you are a finance person doing bookkeeping. If I am a bookkeeper, I'm essentially given all these receipts, right? I have to tally them up. They could be digital. Maybe people are giving me shoe boxes of receipts the old school way. But it's my job to look at those receipts and then essentially attribute which finance expense category they belong to. Attribution in marketing is the same thing. It's different. We use different tools. Nobody hands me a shoebox every day. But essentially, one of my jobs as a marketer is to say, we spent this much on this set of ads, and it was then attributed to this revenue. So not an expense category, but a revenue by channel type category. The way we get there is complicated, and it influences what success looks like. So I would say that like one stage of a CFO asking the right question is, hey, what metrics are we going to pick? So first you establish your goals, you communicate that to your marketer. The marketer then has to pick or suggest appropriate KPIs based on the goals. Some of those we've talked about today. Then we have to make sure that we're attributing and measuring success properly so that the revenue that we declare as being won over by one channel or another is accurate. In other words, like I don't accidentally put everything into one expense category only to realize that it didn't actually come from that expense category, if that makes sense. That then rolls into how a CFO thinks about budgeting, growing the department, adding more, bandwidth onto a creative team. There's tangential departments that all roll up into this stuff. But essentially, it's the same conversation.
I love the way you described that the CFO or CEO or whoever's in charge of kind of the overarching P&L can go to the marketing team, say, hey, listen, these are the goals that we have. You pick the weapon in order on how we measure that. I've never heard it teed up that way, and I think it's awesome.
Yeah, I think great investors have a similar mindset, right? When people think about Buffett and Munger, for instance, they didn't tell the CFO what to do, right? They would hire the right people and on the assumption that they knew what to do, they'd give them targets and let them run their own race. And so I think that's, fairly common at the C level where, people are hired with great seniority and you have to trust them to a degree. And so I think that instances where I've seen things break down a little bit are where the senior marketing people are not trusted and they are just given metrics to target. So when there are things like attribution that are not considered, or the other aspects of performance of these campaigns that are not properly considered. And so you end up putting a box around the marketer or the marketing group. They're artificially constrained by things that may or may not make sense. And so unfortunately, sometimes you see this in public companies where, there are short-term goals to do with like certain revenue targets or whatever, and they trickle down into these like strange types of targets that you have from like how many leads we need this month, as opposed to thinking about the quality of the leads that you're getting, stuff like that. So CFOs can go wrong, in my opinion. I've managed like $4 billion of ads. We've worked with hundreds and hundreds of different companies. I'm an investor in the ad space. If you think about me, if you think about the marketing spend as the like investment currency, like we invest in different channels and it's up to us to report on success, subject to these conversations that we have, which have to be really high quality conversations with a finance team or the VP that we report to or a CMO that we report to. But yeah, so that's kind of like the philosophy that I've seen work really well and where people get tripped up a little bit.
I love how you said that you're essentially a portfolio manager, because I always say that to my team too. Like, look, I look at my job like I'm a master resource allocator. I've been given a number of dollars to go out and spend on people, software, rent, everything else. And it's like, how do you get the best yield out of this? And so you've essentially become a $4 billion portfolio manager in the marketing currency.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally think about it that way. I think that a lot of things can be thought of that way, and I'm absolutely a resource allocator. But it also happens internally at my own business where we have to think about staffing these projects correctly and like all of the different ingredients that a project requires for it to taste right, if that makes sense. And so sometimes they're fractional capabilities that like a really highly specialized, individual on our data science team has. In other cases, it's more general ads management, capability and whatnot. But because we've been running kind of like the McKinsey of ads, for 12, 13 years at this point, we have a really highly distilled, sense of what types of support need to be invested into these projects for them to have the highest likelihood of success. Most companies internally don't tend to have that unless they have like almost accidentally hired the right people in certain cases, or they've been running ads so long that they have the same like bench strength and institutional knowledge that we do, or an agency like us does. Doesn't mean the agencies can't make mistakes, by the way. It's not a perfect science.
Yeah, and something I always go back and forth with CMOs on is, hey, what's the right split here between people and programs? And performance marketing is usually the largest component of that program budget, but it's like you can't go out and spend money if you don't have people in a spot to go and do that. So it's like, what do you do first? You hire the right people so they can administer the programs, or do you just kind of run a skeleton staff, but put a big program budget? But if you think about that, that's not very good resource allocation if you're an investor.
Yeah. So I think part of what you're saying is like, how do you begin this? Do you hire and build a team internally, or do you hire an agency, or what's like the nuance there? And believe it or not, I actually hate agencies in general. Like I never wanted to start an agency. I worked with agencies. I thought they were like these big, dumb, machines that did strange things that didn't make sense. And in most cases, they can be not very good, funny enough. And so when I think about, agency support, it's not right for everyone. I guess my bias creeps in that, we've built an excellent, partner here. And so in a lot of cases, we can help people solve their problems. But more generally speaking, it doesn't matter whether the resources that you ultimately end up hiring come from an agency or in-house, so long as you understand what you're building and what you need to be successful. So again, I'll relate this to finance. In a public company, you'll have everything from a CFO to maybe some financial analysts to like an accounting team on the accounting team, or some bookkeepers or some capability. Maybe that's outsourced. I don't know. There's other things too, but these functions are separate and distinct, and yet they make finance work. You need all of them. In a lot of cases, again, when a C-level team has no prior understanding of, let's call it, digital marketing, performance marketing, growth marketing, whatever you want to call it, or just even marketing, they'll say, yeah, we want to do this. Here are our targets. So they've already established their targets, and we're going to give this department 2 headcount or 1 headcount. So they hire a VP. The VP is the equivalent of hiring like a really senior controller or something like that. When in fact, like to the example in finance I gave, you still need a bookkeeper, which they don't have. You still need a CFO maybe, which they don't have. And so you have these like ill-formed departments, and they just go and hire agencies because they need more support. In certain cases, they think of the support as just bandwidth. They don't necessarily break it down to the functions that are missing. These days, to run paid acquisition correctly, you need creative resources, ads management resources, data resources, testing resources, all kinds of stuff. And so I think it's really important to have enough conversations, do enough research where you understand, again, what your goals are, some metrics that might roll up into those goals, and then you build a team that can answer those questions around attribution, that can like set up campaigns with tests, ingrained in them, learn things, make things move forward. And you kind of index over all the different functions that you need to make the machine run properly. You don't build a car with no wheels type thing. And I see it all the time.
Let's talk a bit about budgeting and running experiments, or budgeting to make sure that car has some wheels. So if you take 100% of a marketing program budget, so without the people in there, what percentage is usually dedicated to advertising? Are there any rules of thumb here? Because I have a hard time sometimes finding benchmarks.
Yeah, I would argue that when I do see those benchmarks, it's more for the like psychological well-being of the people who write the checks on the budget. So it's not like there's some unwritten rule in my industry where it's like 20% must go towards experimentation. Typically, when we see stuff like that, it comes from the mindset of risk allocation, risk management. Someone is afraid that if they spend too much of their budget testing that they won't get the returns that they need to report to the shareholders or to make the company function properly. And so testing is when a performance marketing or growth marketing ad channel is really running properly, everything is a test. 100% of ad spend is a test. Some tests are really small and incremental in nature, and some tests are like game changing, like running a test on a channel you've never run a test on before to prove out whether the channel works, and then finding that it does. That's a pretty big and important learning to determine that Google search suddenly works and you've been buying billboards for 20 years type thing. That's a test. You could also say that on like Meta or TikTok, down to the creative asset level, does this ad outperform this ad? That's a test. And so my point is, generally the body of knowledge that arises from learnings and insights from the data that we collect becomes part of like the playbook, so to speak. We're always testing into that playbook. So the playbook is only as good as like the last campaign that we run. All the conditions in the world change constantly, and we're always trying to test and then determine what worked and what didn't work, and add the things that work into like our primary campaigns that really are spending the most. What didn't work is also very important to understand. So running tests and failing, if you want to call it that, is a really important part of probably not just performance marketing, but investing and running a business. Talk to any entrepreneur and ask them how much they've screwed up. And if they're transparent, it's a lot. Like I know that because I started more than one company, and I was the type of person that unfortunately learned by understanding what I did not want through big and small failures along the way, only to then distill out what I did want. So some people, I guess, are visionaries. They can say, I'm going to write this on the wall, what I want. I know exactly what I want on day one. And other people kind of learn the hard way about that. But the point is, when we run a test and validate, whether the data is, sound or not, whatever it is that we're doing, when we have an outcome that says this does not work, that's a hugely important piece of information. And it really contributes to our long-term success, even though nobody wants, a massive failure, basically. So the idea is you just keep going. These things can obviously take time, and that's part of it.
That's something in my personal development as a CFO that I've had to get better at over time. And that's instead of just looking at the numbers of saying this failed, like, why didn't you get us a return on this investment? I've now started to say, good. Okay, good job. Like now we know that channel doesn't work.
What did we learn?
Thank you for exploring that. Now we can rule it out and try to put it towards something else. And that wasn't even in my vocabulary probably a year ago.
Yeah. I think, different people have different appetites for success and failure, and they have different senses of what is reasonable within that context. So I would also say that at a certain point, if it's just failure after failure after failure, and 12 months has rolled by, that's a pretty strong signal that either you don't have the right team or this just isn't working for you. Time and money are kind of the two parts of the experimentation. They're the two things, the two levers, I think, that govern testing, to your earlier question. So you can spend a lot of money and learn a lot more quickly about what, works or doesn't work, or you can have less money and it'll just take a lot more time. And this plays into, channels like Meta ads or Google ads or TikTok or programmatic or audio ad units, on podcasts or whatever it is that we have been talking about very well. And then obviously there's more complexity around the validity of all of this and testing, validating whether something actually worked or not. But generally speaking, it's like a time and money thing.
Because something that I struggle with is how much is enough time. Am I cutting people off too soon, or am I letting dollars ride on the table for too long?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think that there's we'll do a little thought experiment here. So most people would understand that, an experiment can't run in just one day. I can't even probably set it up in a day, but let's pretend that I could. The results wouldn't be very telling after a single day, no matter how much you're spending. Similarly, we can probably agree that taking 12 months to run one test to tell you one thing is way too long. And so that means that somewhere between, the day and the 12 months is a reasonable period for a test to elapse and for us to give it all the supporting conditions that it needs to be a valid test. The thing that we run into most often psychologically is actually impatience. And so people want results fast, and yet they don't necessarily want to spend into the unknown where they don't know what the results are going to be. So there's a real, power struggle between the psychology of impatience and the like practicality of like doing the work, setting it up properly in a professional manner that's defensible when it's looked at, and then running an appropriate test. A lot of times we get stuck in the quarterly grind of things, and so the way that marketers can compensate for that is by changing your goalposts for what a test means. Run a faster test, come up with a thesis that is more easily provable and rolls up into this other piece of information that you're getting, right? And also coach the stakeholders within the organization. If it's a finance person that's ultimately funding this, which it often is, talk to them about time versus money and the conditions necessary to run a test, and concepts that we haven't talked about yet, like data sufficiency. All of the AI powered ad serving algorithms or machine learning capabilities, whatever we want to call them, they require a certain amount of information in order to make great choices as to where your ads show up. Otherwise, they never exit their learning phase. And so these days, in the world of like ChatGPT, people kind of understand the concept of these like models, I think they're being called these days. They need a lot of data to have to be able to do what they're supposed to do, essentially. And an advertising platform also built on AI is literally no different. And when you do something like set up a test to validate whether something works or doesn't work, if you get a ton of data back really quickly in the form of conversions, it might be easier, to have enough evidence to determine both, whether the test was valid and then also whether it worked. If you don't, you can just run that test for longer. But the point that I'm making ultimately is just really that there's a psychological component to this that has nothing to do with the performance. And it's like literally like, how mature are the stakeholders within the organization, and is the marketing team also making tests that are taking too long to run, type thing. And so there's no like right answer here. It's more that people just have to be aware of the human nature aspect of this, the psychology of impatience, and then the practicality that like a marketing professional, the things we have to do and operate in order to give you the high quality piece of information that you're looking for.
And I think the impatience that you're mentioning, Jonathan, a lot of that comes from a lack of clarity on what the expectations are. Like two areas that I've made mistakes in the past working with marketing leaders is I've approved experiments to be run, but I've not been clear at the beginning on the data sufficiency that's required. And I've not been clear about, hey, when's the date we'll know by? So instead I just get impatient. Like this isn't working. We have to pull the plug.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you hit the nail on the head there. You're only guilty of not knowing what you don't know in those situations, and nor should you. You're in finance, right? And so I know that running a successful test early stage is a process of aligning stakeholders, making sure that I'm heard on like the goalposts, like why are we doing this? Hopefully there's foundational alignment there that we've already discussed. And then basically providing a roadmap as to how we're going to get there. And that's inclusive of the testing. And so performance marketers frequently are told that they're not being strategic enough. And that's because honestly, they're reacting to day-to-day data. It takes a lot to manage these platforms in a certain case. The conversations that you're in as a CFO maybe shouldn't be as much about like the tests that we're running and more about like insights that have been learned or like disproved, let's call it. And then strategic choices that we're making. Where are we going to place our bets, and why do we want to do that, and what is the ask from finance? And so we often think about this whole process of communication, like at Thrive, as well. We use the analogy of a clock with a second hand, a minute hand, and an hour hand. And we say that the second hand of communication is like the day-to-day chatter, whether it's on Slack or someone picks up the phone, we're talking, we're making, minor campaign adjustments, tweaks, uploading ad creative, whatever it is. The minute hand is kind of like the weekly meeting where we're like, talking about like the high level results of this, and we might be tweaking, budget or something like that. The hour hand is where you start to see more like a quarterly meeting where different stakeholders show up in a conversation, and we're not talking about the results of tactics or low-level experiments. We're talking about big wins and big losses, what the plan was, what we learned, and what the plan now needs to be. And then we're asking for resource approval, like from finance or from HR in terms of headcount or, or type thing. And so when that is done properly, you stop hearing the like, you're not being strategic enough thing. And it also, when it's aligned properly with how the organization functions internally, I find that finance leaders are not panicked about, what a paid acquisition team is doing because they fully understand why they're doing it, how they're doing it, and how it then rolls up into quarterly planning type thing. And so we see this done really well sometimes and really poorly in most cases, I would say. And part of what we have to do is unpack this like infrastructure that allows for alignment of goals and communication and proper resource allocation and planning.
And part of that data sufficiency we were alluding to is having good attribution. Can you describe what you look for in attribution from a good campaign? And then maybe you could also touch on like, has attribution got easier or harder over time?
I'll speak to that really quickly. The technology that we use is actually getting worse. And there's going to be like a point where privacy concerns and the competition between, the channels themselves probably lands in a place where there's tools that aren't so like, exposed, I think, to these types of changes. But for now, and rightfully so, a lot of changes have been made because of privacy concerns. That stuff is good for humanity, I think. And then you see like, Apple and Google and Facebook kind of all battling each other, I should say. And, Apple has the iOS, changes that it made where it removed a whole bunch of data that, all the channels could use, and it really hurts Facebook. And Google is sunsetting third-party cookies in Chrome type thing. And so that's going to be a big change and whatnot. And so I think that, ultimately, when I think about attribution these days, so we came from a place where, Google ads would say, these are the various attribution models that are offered. Pick one, and targeting will be predicated based on this attribution. That is pretty much deprecated. So we're no longer able to really rely on the channels themselves to tell us, quote, whether it's working. In a modern sense, that is one piece of evidence that we will look at in this like ongoing investigation of the question of what is working and to what extent. And so, sure, I will take, what Google or Facebook or TikTok tells me about attribution as one signal as to like which direction the wind is going. But I'm also going to build a media mix model. So like a linear regression model that allows us to kind of map out what the average of sales looks like and whether there's a spike that was causal in nature to something that we did. We can do things like geo holdout tests. So it's kind of an incrementality study as to whether the baseline of performance was affected by in a particular geographic location by something that we did. And so none of these things are perfect though, but now suddenly the toolkit that we're using is significantly broader in terms of providing pieces of evidence as to whether it is or is not working. So in an example where Google says that, this revenue is fully attributed to this set of Google campaigns that you ran, we don't trust that. So we do an incrementality study in the form of a geo holdout, study across an entire state that then says, yes, there was incremental revenue, based on additional ad spend in this particular geographic region. And then we try and validate that using a media mix model based on a lot of historic data and whether there is suddenly an outlier that we can like time to when we spent, XYZ budget or something like that. If they all say the same thing, I still don't really know whether it's true, but all the evidence points in the right direction. And again, like, in a court case, evidence is presented and there's some sort of judge or jury that has to determine whether someone is guilty or not, right? And this is, based on a number of different principles, but ultimately the evidence that is brought forward. Sometimes it's easier to tell, sometimes it's really difficult to tell in that context. I would argue that this type of business decision, does it work or not, is equally difficult. And so a lot of what we do is this testing, measurement, validation, and attribution of the spend. Now, we're pretty good at this. So in a lot of cases, the evidence is quite compelling and strong, but not always, though. And so we do still have these questions, and it's not perfect. And certainly we live in a place where because of some of the aforementioned, things that have happened in the world, I think that the technology is actually worse today than it was, let's say, 10 years ago when there was like the wild west of what we do and no rules.
And that goes back to my joke at the top of the pod where I was saying 80% of marketing dollars flow to Google, because eventually people just Google things and then Google takes credit for it. You can't really figure out who it really was at the end of the day. And because the platforms that we're plowing more money into are actually making it harder for us to see where it comes from, it just kind of all gets into this amorphous blob.
Totally agree. Yeah. But your question is bang on. Like, this is really what you're talking about, are kind of the sets of concerns that we see from not only finance teams, but just, various C-level teams, the marketing groups that we report to themselves. These are the problems that practitioners of what we do are trying to solve.
You heard it here first, folks. Lack of attribution, good for humanity, bad for your marketing budget. Jonathan, I wanna go over a couple fun ones here towards the end. So I'm curious if you've heard any cool stories of companies out there that have grown maybe their entire business really around one channel, or maybe they found a kink in the armor that they just ruthlessly exploited to grow a company.
Yeah. So I can give you a bit. I think I've like talked about some of these examples before. I can give you some examples. So I think when people talk about this question, they tend to gravitate towards like the flashy like startups that found, a hack and then exploited the hack. And maybe there's a success story there, or maybe it wasn't so successful over time. One example of like kind of a company that no one talks about that I think is absolutely fascinating in terms of their approach to digital marketing is actually Expedia. So anyone who is in our industry, there's like this conversation between like branded keywords and non-branded keywords in search. So in other words, like, do you bid on the name of your own company, or would you have got those clicks anyway? That is because it's incredibly lucrative potentially to do this, to bid on branded keywords. But again, it comes down to an attribution question of like, were people searching for me like because I did something different? And if am I essentially double paying if I like then place an ad above my own branded keywords and search results? So like whatever, that's just this big ongoing debate. Expedia basically being like, an online booking engine for travel everything, really took this whole like strategy and scaled it when they realized they could use paid search to bid on the branded keywords of essentially every single hotel in the world. So when we think about like top of funnel and bottom of funnel, top of funnel being, targeting a group of people that may or may not be aware of the service or product that you're selling, versus bottom of the funnel being, targeting people who are like really ready to purchase and have a high degree of intent. They're already seeking you out by name, probably because you're in their mind and they're considering you. Branded search falls at the very bottom of that funnel. And so what Expedia did is basically say, well, Google, we're going to bid on every single, branded keyword of every single hotel in the world eventually. And essentially that means that they had a higher likelihood at one point of basically getting a conversion for a particular hotel keyword than the hotel itself, because of their comparison engine.
That's a savage move. They basically they hijacked their traffic.
They hijacked all the traffic. Yeah, exactly. But they did it in like this incredibly elegant and efficient way. And I believe I heard that at one point, I don't know if it's still true, but Expedia became the largest advertiser on Google. I think it was like $1 billion a month that they were spending. That is, I would have to validate that. And like, I don't think Google publishes this or anything like that, but I'm pretty sure I heard that number. Whether it's true today, I don't know, but $1 billion a month on essentially branded search keywords of hotels. And they were able to drive a massive business out of that. So it's one of the examples where like maybe, Expedia isn't like an startup, and it's not exactly making headlines, and like your friends don't talk about how cool Expedia is, but they really found like the ultimate hack on search, on Google search, and became probably, the biggest proponent of this methodology in the world for a long, long time. So I think that that's one of the single most interesting things I've ever seen a company do in the history of digital advertising in terms of the scale and success that they achieved. And even to this day, I think Expedia has enormous market share in the online travel agent sector. I think another one is probably Athletic Greens. So I've never worked with Athletic Greens, but I know a bunch of the folks, on their ads team, super, super talented people that know exactly what they're doing. And again, they kind of like got to this place where suddenly, maybe in 2021, 2022, they were kind of everywhere. So we talked about podcasts earlier, they were and might still be actually an advertiser on like every podcast I seem to listen to.
Yeah, I joked that Athletic Greens and Eight Sleep sponsor every podcast but mine.
Yeah. Also, I can't open TikTok and not see one of their ads in a single session. And they were huge on Facebook and huge on search. And like they were just literally everywhere. And so, sometimes people are literally, what you were alluding to, like, does this stuff work? And the answer is like, yes, but not the same for everybody. Like sometimes it takes a long time to work and it doesn't really work very well, like I suppose. And in other cases, it causes like real scale. Suddenly everybody knew what Athletic Greens was after like 10 years of them being in business. This was like a wholesale business predominantly. And they created this massive direct to consumer side, DTC, right? And so that was mostly because suddenly whether you realized it or not, you had heard of them. And then when eventually they placed an ad in front of you, whether you realized it or not, after the fourth or fifth time that your brain recalled their name, you're just more likely to buy the product and stuff. And so, part of that was paid acquisition. And then part of it was organic. Like I think they also were really good at content, and their customers became, big promoters of what they were doing and all of these different things. I guess another one, that comes to mind is probably Grammarly. Grammarly like painted YouTube with, ads for a really long time. And I think that drove a ton of their adoption. Again, I'm pretty confident that they were the largest advertiser on YouTube globally for a period of time. And so, but what did it do? It drove considerable awareness of what they are and the problem that they solve. And they became a huge company as a result of that. Would I recommend this tactic to everyone? No. Most of the companies that I just mentioned have like very, very strong product market fit. So for them, they were like, this totally works. People love what we do, and we just need to scale it. Whereas not every company knows whether if they do that, it will work or not. Also, all of these companies have incredibly sophisticated ad measurement capabilities. So the stuff that I talked about, Thrive doing for a lot of our clients, they just can do this natively and they have all the capabilities in-house.
I love these stories because it at a certain level they kept it stupid simple. And I joke with my CMO all the time, like if you prove that we can just go after this one channel maniacally, we're gonna punch that channel till our hand bleeds. Like that, we're totally fine with that.
I hear that from like literally everyone that I've ever spoken to in finance. We will fund this, as much as we possibly can. You have a blank check as long as it works. And then of course the devil's in the details, and we have to prove out whether it can in fact scale and work or not.
He's on to us, folks.
A lot of the stuff that we've worked on has scaled, but we've also, conclusively proved in a lot of cases that things like don't work, which I think is also really important.
Last question. I'm with a marketing guru right now. Super Bowl is coming up. Any idea how much an ad will cost this year?
Last year, what was it? $7 million for a 30-second spot?
$7 million.
Something like that. I think that might have been average. And obviously there's like
the start of the game's worth more.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not just like one price, but I won't be surprised if it's deep in the 8 figures this year. And I think that, this is something that, again, falls into the whole, like, is it working type narrative. It's very difficult to measure the impact of television sometimes, but there's such a captive audience with like certain demographics, in a Super Bowl setting that if you get the creative right, this could be like the biggest opportunity for you to, launch a particular project ever type thing. And so I think that, it comes down to getting the right spot. Obviously there's probably a negotiation there. And then the creative, as you know, is everything. People like rank like the funniest Super Bowl ads, and it feels like funny really works in a Super Bowl context. So if you can figure out how to crack that nut, it works.
Do you have a favorite Super Bowl ad from all the years?
You're speaking to someone who has seen like an unhealthy amount of ads over the years. Some of them are like really effective and some of them are less effective. Honestly, not really. I don't have like one specific one that really makes it for me. I think though that ultimately it's a good like microcosm or macrocosm of like the creative question when it comes to what we do. It's obvious that a really hilarious ad during the Super Bowl just sells and really works. That's a really good like analog, I guess, for just all content and ads in general. Like if it fits the audience properly and gives them what they're expecting to see or surprises them, it'll make the impact that you want. If it's really dull and boring and like no one cares, no one's going to do anything, creative's super important.
Yeah, I end up like not even paying attention to the ad because the whole time, like as a finance guy, I'm like, I have to sell 6.5 million bags of Doritos just to pay for this ad. So
See, that's the finance mindset again, whereas I see it as an investment that pays off for years to come, right? So, but actually, that's a really good example of this problem. Like a real seasoned marketer is going to be like, okay, like when I spend $7 million during the Super Bowl, my message is going to get out to a whole bunch of people about whatever it is that I'm selling, and if I do a good job of the creative, it's going to stick for a while, right? Whereas a finance person might be like, what was our same store sales that day or something like that?
yeah, that's what I would ask them to look at.
And so the question then becomes, how do you measure the impact of a top of funnel Super Bowl ad? And we would be able to plan a whole methodology around how to do that essentially. I think like, to cap it off, everything can be performance marketing if it is run properly. Whereas like we used to just think of these like pay-per-click and programmatic media buying channels like Meta and Google as like performance marketing. These days, because the technology to measure has actually got worse, there are like higher quality tools outside of that. And we can set up infrastructure and methodologies to give really quality evidence and answer the question of, is it working? So, we're going to start doing this around like radio buying. And we've already done a lot of that testing to validate or invalidate different types of programmatic, out of home, probably eventually TV, all of this stuff. And so I can't wait to do that because we're so well positioned, us as Thrive, and then also probably just generally the industry, to start to prove to you that there's long-term value in investing in these areas.
Jonathan, thank you so much for making me smarter on marketing. You're one of the best in the business. Where can people find you if they want more?
Thanks so much. So I'm on LinkedIn under Jonathan Becker, Twitter, JZ Becker, and you can always find me at thrivedigital.com.
Love it. Thanks for joining me, man.
Thanks, CJ. Great to talk to you.
Roll the credits, producer Nancy. The Run the Numbers podcast is part of the Turpentine network of podcasts. It is produced by Nancy Hsu and edited by Justin Golden. Artwork made by Some AI Thing. Yelling and intro by Fat Joe. Don't forget to give us 5 stars. I really need this.